Imagine the worst-case scenario. Marcus Rivera crouches in the skeletal remains of a ransacked pharmacy in what used to be Boulder, Colorado. His fingers numb, despite the wool gloves he fashioned from a car seat 3 weeks ago, watching the thermometer outside read -8 degrees Fahrenheit, while the 12-year-old boy beside him struggles to breathe through lungs damaged by smoke inhalation during the fires that followed the electromagnetic pulse. 42 days have passed since every electronic device on the planet became useless metal and plastic, since the nuclear reactors began their meltdowns without computer systems to regulate them, since the ash from those meltdowns and the subsequent urban fires created a nuclear winter that dropped global temperatures by 30 degrees and turned the sky into a permanent twilight of grey and brown. The boy, whose name is Samuel and who hasn't seen his parents since the first week when society collapsed into chaos and violence, is running a fever of 103 degrees, and Marcus knows with absolute certainty that without antibiotics, without a warm shelter, without the kind of medical care that no longer exists anywhere on Earth, this child has maybe 72 hours before pneumonia finishes what the smoke started. His decade of Marine survival training screams at him that they need heat, they need medicine, they need clean water, they need all of it immediately, but his pack contains only a water filter he made from a plastic bottle and activated charcoal. A knife with a blade he's sharpened so many times it's half its original width, and 3 cans of expired soup he found yesterday in a basement that still smelled of the family who died there. The wind howls through broken windows, carrying ash that tastes like metal and death, and Marcus spots something that makes his heart pound with possibility: a shelf of veterinary antibiotics still intact behind a collapsed counter, fish antibiotics that are chemically identical to human medications, amoxicillin and doxycycline in foil packets that might still be viable, and he remembers the dosage calculations his medic training drilled into him during combat deployments to Afghanistan. Samuel coughs again, a wet rattling sound that Marcus has heard too many times in the past 6 weeks, the sound that means time is running out, and he realizes that survival now means more than just staying alive until tomorrow. It means preserving the knowledge that can keep others alive. It means teaching anyone who will listen that civilization didn't die when the power went out. It died when people stopped sharing what they knew, stopped helping each other, stopped believing that knowledge could save lives when nothing else would. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light from this survivor's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. This is the story of Marcus Rivera, a 35-year-old former Marine who spent his 20s teaching survival skills to soldiers who would deploy to the most hostile environments on Earth, who returned home to Colorado to run wilderness survival courses for civilians, who was leading a weekend workshop in Rocky Mountain National Park when the electromagnetic pulse hit and turned his peaceful life into a daily fight for existence. In those first chaotic days, Marcus tried to reach his family in Denver, only to find the city consumed by fires and violence, the roads choked with abandoned cars and desperate people, his apartment building a smoking ruin with no sign of his younger sister Maria or his elderly father. With nowhere else to go and no one else to save, Marcus began moving through the wasteland that Colorado had become, teaching survivors the skills that separated life from death, trading his knowledge for food and shelter, documenting everything he learned in a journal he kept tucked against his chest because he believed that someday, somehow, humanity would need this information to rebuild. The electromagnetic pulse had destroyed more than electronics. It had destroyed the invisible infrastructure of knowledge that modern society depended on. The ability to look up how to purify water or treat infections or build a shelter that could keep you alive in sub-zero temperatures. Marcus became a ghost moving through the ruins. A teacher without a classroom, a survivor who refused to let humanity's accumulated knowledge die with the power grid. And this is the story of what he learned, what he taught, and what it cost him to stay human in a world that had forgotten how. The veterinary clinic had been ransacked like every other building Marcus had entered in the past 6 weeks, but ransacked by people who were looking for human medications, for painkillers and sedatives, and anything that could help them escape the horror of what the world had become. They had ignored the veterinary supplies, not knowing or not caring that many animal antibiotics are chemically identical to human formulations, that fish amoxicillin and human amoxicillin are the same molecule in different packaging. Marcus moved through the debris, with Samuel leaning heavily against him, the boy's fever making him compliant and quiet in a way that worried Marcus more than complaints would have. He found a mostly intact bottle of Fishmox Forte, 500 milligram amoxicillin capsules designed for treating bacterial infections in aquarium fish, now potentially the only thing standing between Samuel and a death by pneumonia in a frozen pharmacy. The dosage calculations ran through his mind automatically, muscle memory from combat medicine training that had saved lives in Afghan villages and might save this one child in the ruins of American civilization. 20 to 25 milligrams per kilogram of body weight every 8 hours. Samuel probably weighed around 40 kilograms, so that meant 800 to 1,000 milligrams per dose. 2 capsules every 8 hours, assuming the medication was still viable and the infection was bacterial and not viral. Assuming Samuel could keep the pills down despite his fever. Assuming 100 things that Marcus couldn't control but had to try anyway because the alternative was watching a child die. The cold was the immediate problem, more urgent even than the antibiotics. Samuel's body was fighting a fever in an environment where the ambient temperature was -8 degrees, his immune system burning through calories. He didn't have to fight an infection, while the cold worked to steal every bit of warmth his body generated. Marcus scanned the pharmacy for materials, his mind automatically categorizing everything he saw through the lens of survival utility. Trash bags, dozens of them in a box behind the counter, black plastic that could serve as windbreaks or waterproofing, bubble wrap from shipping packages, air pockets that could provide insulation, Mylar emergency blankets forgotten in a first aid display, their reflective surfaces capable of bouncing 90% of radiant body heat back toward the source. He began gathering materials with the methodical efficiency that had kept him alive through 42 days of post-apocalyptic winter, explaining each choice to Samuel even though the boy was barely conscious, because teaching was how Marcus stayed sane, how he reminded himself that knowledge mattered, that civilization was just the accumulation of techniques passed from one person to another. He found a storage room in the back that still had 3 walls and most of a ceiling, protected from the wind that howled through the main pharmacy. The floor was concrete, which would conduct heat away from Samuel's body through a process called conduction heat loss, so Marcus layered cardboard shipping boxes flat across the ground to create an insulating barrier between the boy and the thermal sink of the floor. On top of the cardboard he placed the bubble wrap, popped side up so the air pockets would trap warm air, the same way a sleeping bag traps air between layers of insulation. He wrapped Samuel in 3 of the Mylar emergency blankets, shiny, side, facing inward to reflect the boy's body heat back toward him, then created an outer shell using the black trash bags, cutting and folding them to create a vapor barrier that would prevent moisture from Samuel's breath and sweat from condensing in the insulation layers and destroying their effectiveness. The principle was simple. The same principle that made a down jacket work or a modern sleeping bag function: trap air in layers and prevent that air from moving through convection or escaping through radiation. Marcus had built similar emergency shelters during winter warfare training in Alaska, had taught hundreds of civilians how to survive unexpected overnight exposure during his wilderness courses. But this was different because Samuel wasn't a student on a weekend adventure. He was a child who might die if Marcus made a mistake. The antibiotics came next. 2 capsules given with water that Marcus had purified yesterday using a method he'd taught to at least 50 survivors in the past month. He pulled out his makeshift filter system, a plastic water bottle with the bottom cut off, inverted and packed with layers of material in a specific sequence that would remove both particles and pathogens. At the bottom went a coffee filter to keep the other materials in place, then 2 inches of sand that Marcus had baked in a metal pan over a fire to sterilize it, then 3 inches of activated charcoal crushed from water filter cartridges he'd scavenged, then another 2 inches of sand, then a layer of small gravel to prevent channeling where water might flow through the filter without being treated. The charcoal was the key, its porous structure providing millions of tiny spaces where bacteria and parasites would be trapped and where chemical contaminants would bond to the carbon molecules through a process called adsorption. He poured water from a melted snow collection through the filter, then added 2 drops per liter of unscented household bleach he'd found in a janitor's closet. 5% sodium hypochlorite that would kill any pathogens the filter missed, waiting 30 minutes for the bleach to work before giving Samuel the water to wash down the antibiotics. The boy swallowed the pills without complaint, his fever making him docile, and Marcus wrapped him tighter in the emergency shelter system, checking the layers to make sure no gaps existed where cold air could penetrate and no moisture was accumulating between the insulation and the vapor barrier. Outside the storage room, the temperature continued to drop as the weak sun disappeared behind the ash-choked clouds, and Marcus knew they would need heat soon, real heat from combustion, not just the passive retention of Samuel's failing body warmth. But fire meant smoke. Smoke meant attention. Attention meant other survivors who might be desperate enough to kill for the antibiotics and supplies Marcus carried, and so he faced the same calculation he'd faced a dozen times since the collapse, the equation between immediate survival needs and longer-term security concerns that had no clear answer. He decided on a small fire, minimal smoke, positioned in a way that would be invisible from outside the building. Using a technique he'd learned from Native American fire-making traditions and refined through years of teaching, Marcus built what was called a Dakota fire pit, a method that provided maximum heat with minimum smoke and light signature. He found 2 metal trash cans in the alley behind the pharmacy, cut ventilation holes in the bottom of one using his knife, and placed it inside the other can to create a double wall system that would channel air through the combustion process more efficiently. Inside the inner can, he layered tinder, kindling, and fuel in the precise ratio that would create a hot, clean-burning fire. The tinder was dried cattail fluff he'd been carrying for 3 days, material that would ignite from a single spark. The kindling was small twigs and cardboard strips arranged in a teepee structure that would allow oxygen to flow upward through the developing flame. The fuel was broken furniture wood, dried and split to expose maximum surface area to the flame. He struck his ferro rod, a ferrocerium rod he'd carried since his Marine days, using the spine of his knife to scrape sparks that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite even damp tinder if he was careful about his technique. The cattail fluff caught on the second strike, the spark landing in the center of the fibrous material and spreading in a slow-motion bloom of orange light. Marcus bent close and breathed on the developing coal, feeding it oxygen in slow, steady exhalations that were gentle enough not to blow out the fragile flame, but strong enough to accelerate the combustion reaction. The kindling caught, flames licking up through the teepee structure, and he began adding fuel pieces one at a time, never smothering the fire with too much material at once, always maintaining the balance between fuel, oxygen, and heat that was necessary for sustained combustion. Within 15 minutes, the storage room was warm enough that Marcus could remove his gloves, the fire burning hot and nearly smokeless in its contained environment, the heat radiating out in waves that slowly pushed back the killing cold. Samuel stopped shivering, a good sign that his body wasn't having to work as hard to maintain its core temperature, and Marcus allowed himself a moment of cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, this child would survive to see morning. He pulled out his journal, the notebook where he'd been documenting survival techniques and lessons learned, writing by firelight because he believed that someday someone would need this information, that human knowledge was too precious to let die in the ruins of the old world. He wrote about the antibiotic dosages, about the filter system, about the emergency shelter construction and the Dakota fire pit design. He wrote about the mistakes he'd seen people make, like building fires too large, or shelters without proper ventilation, or trying to purify water with methods that didn't actually kill pathogens. He wrote about Samuel, about finding the boy 3 days ago in a collapsed grocery store, about the parents who had sent their son to hide in a storage closet during the food riots and never came back. He wrote about the crushing weight of responsibility that came with being the person others turned to for answers, about the children he'd failed to save despite his knowledge and training, about the guilt that gnawed at him every time he lay down to sleep. Footsteps outside the building made Marcus freeze, his hand moving automatically to the knife on his belt. 3 people, maybe 4, walking slowly through the pharmacy, searching for something. Marcus covered Samuel's mouth gently to keep him quiet, whispered for the boy to stay silent, and moved toward the storage room door with his blade drawn. Through the gap he could see them, 2 women and a man, all bundled in layers of scavenged clothing, moving with the careful desperation of people who had been hungry for a long time. The man carried a crowbar, the women had nothing visible, and Marcus faced another impossible choice. They weren't threatening, at least not yet, but resources were finite, and every mouth to feed was another calculation in the survival equation. His Marine training said to stay hidden, to let them pass, to avoid contact because any encounter was a potential conflict. His conscience said that he had knowledge they might need, that turning away from people in need was how humanity had fallen so far so fast after the collapse. He made a decision that would change everything. Marcus stepped out of the storage room, with his hands visible and empty. The knife returned to his belt, his voice calm and non-threatening. He told them about the veterinary antibiotics, about the proper dosages, about which medications were safe for humans and which were toxic. He showed them the water filtration system, explained the bleach treatment protocol, demonstrated the emergency shelter construction using materials they could find in any abandoned building. The man, whose name was Terence, and who had been a high school history teacher before the collapse, stared at Marcus like he was seeing a ghost, like the concept of someone sharing knowledge freely was so foreign to the new world that it couldn't be real. The younger woman, Priya, who had been a nurse before the electromagnetic pulse and who hadn't been able to save her own daughter despite her medical training, actually cried when Marcus gave her a handful of the fish antibiotics and explained how to calculate pediatric dosages. They stayed together that night, the 5 of them sharing the warmth of the fire and the small amount of food they collectively carried. Marcus taught them about fire safety, about the importance of proper ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning, about the dangers of burning certain materials that released toxic fumes. He showed them how to tell if water was safe to drink by checking for clarity and smell, how to construct a solar still using plastic sheeting and a container, how to identify edible plants in the winter wasteland by recognizing dried seed heads and root structures. Terence told stories about his students, about the kids he'd been teaching when the pulse hit, about the boy who had helped him escape the school when the fires started. Priya talked about triage, about making impossible decisions about who to treat and who to let die when resources were limited, about the guilt that came with every choice. The older woman, whose name was Elena and who spoke with an accent that suggested Eastern European origins, told them about surviving the Sarajevo siege in the 1990s, about what she'd learned during 4 years of urban warfare and privation that was now saving her life again. She talked about how communities had survived by pooling resources and knowledge, about how the people who tried to hoard everything for themselves usually died alone, about how trust was the most valuable currency in a collapsed society, even though it was the hardest thing to give. Marcus listened and learned, adding her wisdom to his journal, understanding that survival expertise came from many sources and that his military training was just one perspective among many. Samuel woke up near midnight, his fever broken to 99 degrees, asking for food and water, with a clarity that meant the antibiotics were working. Marcus felt something in his chest crack open, a release of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying, and he understood in that moment why he kept teaching, why he kept helping, why he hadn't given up and joined the thousands who had simply walked into the cold and let the winter take them. The boy lived. Knowledge saved him. That had to mean something, had to matter in a world where most things no longer did. They left together at dawn, 5 survivors becoming a team, each person contributing something to the collective survival. Terence knew the area, could navigate by landmarks even with the GPS satellites silent, and the street signs buried in ash. Priya had medical knowledge that complemented Marcus's combat medicine training. Elena had experience with long-term siege survival, with preserving food and managing water supplies and organizing communities. Samuel, despite his age and his illness, had something equally valuable. He could move through small spaces, could scavenge in areas adults couldn't reach, could see the world with the clarity that came from not remembering the way things used to be. Marcus taught them as they walked, turning every obstacle into a lesson, every challenge into an opportunity to demonstrate another survival technique. They found a neighborhood that had been spared the worst of the fires, houses with walls and roofs mostly intact, a creek that still flowed despite the ice and ash. Marcus made the decision to stop running and start building, to create a permanent shelter that could survive the winter, that might last months or years, depending on how much ash remained in the atmosphere. The others agreed, tired of being refugees, ready to try to carve out some small piece of stability in the chaos. They chose a house with good southern exposure, intact windows they could cover with plastic for insulation, and a fireplace they could use for heat and cooking if they built a proper chimney system. The first priority was insulation, turning the house into a thermal shell that could retain heat generated by their bodies and small fires. Marcus taught them about the principles of heat loss, about how heat escaped through conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation, about how stopping each type of loss required different strategies. They gathered leaves, dried grass, and cattail fluff from the frozen creek, materials that would provide dead air space for insulation when packed between layers. Using trash bags as vapor barriers, they created walls within walls, double-layer construction that increased the thermal resistance of the house's envelope by a factor of 5. Marcus showed them how to test for air leaks using smoke from a smoldering stick, how to seal gaps with mud and ash mixed into a primitive cork, how to create a cold trap entrance that would prevent warm air from escaping every time they opened the door. Priya focused on medicine, converting one room into a clinic where she could treat injuries and illnesses using the veterinary supplies they'd scavenged and the herbal remedies Elena remembered from her grandmother. She created storage systems for different medications, organized by type and expiration date, always conscious that every pill used was one less pill available for future emergencies. She taught the others basic first aid, how to clean wounds to prevent infection, how to create splints for broken bones, how to recognize the signs of dangerous conditions like internal bleeding or concussions. Her nursing training had prepared her for working with limited resources, but nothing had prepared her for working with no resources, for having to choose between treating a child's ear infection or saving antibiotics for potentially life-threatening pneumonia cases. Terence took responsibility for food, applying his knowledge of history to the practical problems of preservation and storage. He remembered studying how medieval communities survived winters without refrigeration, how Native American tribes had preserved meat and vegetables before European contact, how siege populations had stretched limited rations across months of privation. He built a smoking chamber using an old metal drum, experimenting with different woods to find which created smoke that would preserve meat without making it inedible. He dug a root cellar, insulated with straw and designed to maintain temperatures just above freezing through the winter, perfect for storing potatoes and carrots and other vegetables they might find or grow. He created a system for rationing their food, calculating caloric needs based on activity level and body weight, always leaving a buffer for emergencies. Elena organized the community because within days other survivors had found them, drawn by the smoke from their fires and the hope that someone somewhere was creating something more than just day-to-day survival. She established rules about resource sharing, about work expectations, about conflict resolution. She created a council system where decisions were made collectively, where everyone's voice mattered regardless of their skills or contributions. She remembered how quickly the Sarajevo community had fallen apart when trust broke down, how violence and hoarding had killed more people than the siege itself, and she was determined not to let that happen again. When a man named James tried to steal food from the communal stores, Elena didn't punish him. She sat him down and asked why he felt he needed to steal, what fear was driving his actions. It turned out James had a diabetic daughter hidden in a nearby basement, too weak to walk, dying slowly because she couldn't get insulin. Elena brought the girl to their community, added her to the rationing system, and James became one of their most dedicated workers, ashamed of his theft, but grateful for the second chance. Marcus continued to teach, but his lessons evolved as winter deepened and new challenges emerged. He showed them how to make tools from scavenged materials, turning car leaf springs into knife blades, fashioning needles from fish bones, and thread from dental floss. He demonstrated water purification methods that didn't rely on fire, using ultraviolet light from the weak sun when it occasionally broke through the ash clouds, explaining that 6 hours of UV exposure could kill most pathogens in clear water. He taught rope making from plant fibers, basket weaving from willow branches, pottery from creek clay that could be fired in their wood stoves. Every skill he shared was another piece of the civilization they were trying to rebuild, another link in the chain of knowledge that connected them to 10,000 years of human ingenuity. But winter was winning. The ash in the atmosphere wasn't clearing, the temperatures kept dropping, and the food they'd scavenged from abandoned stores was running out faster than Terence's rationing system could stretch it. People were hungry, constantly hungry, burning through calories, just trying to stay warm in a world where the sun barely rose above the horizon and the temperatures rarely climbed above zero. Marcus watched children grow thin, watched adults grow hollow-eyed and desperate, and he understood that teaching survival techniques wasn't enough if there wasn't enough food to survive on. He made the decision to lead a scavenging expedition into Denver, into the ruins that he'd avoided since the first week after the collapse. 20 volunteers went with him, each person carrying empty backpacks and pulling makeshift sleds, ready to search the warehouses and stores that might still contain food if they were willing to brave the radiation and the violence. Marcus knew the risks, knew that Denver was where desperate people went to die or to take from others, But he also knew that his community would starve without more supplies, that knowledge meant nothing if there wasn't enough food to keep people alive long enough to use it. The journey took 3 days through snow that fell like grey ash, and ash that fell like black snow. The sky, a perpetual twilight that turned noon into dusk, and dusk into a darkness so complete that navigation became guesswork. They moved in a tight group, watching for other survivors, for the gangs that had formed in the ruins, for the signs of violence that marked territory controlled by people who had abandoned any pretense of humanity. Marcus led them to a warehouse district he remembered from before the collapse. Massive buildings where food distributors had stored supplies for the mountain communities, places that might still contain calories if the looters had missed them or couldn't get inside. The first 3 warehouses were empty, picked clean by survivors who had come before them, but the 4th had a collapsed roof that had blocked the main entrance, discouraging looters who didn't want to risk the unstable structure. Marcus and 4 others crawled through a gap in the debris, their headlamps casting weak circles of light in the dusty darkness, and found themselves in a paradise of preserved food. Canned goods by the pallet, 50-pound bags of rice and beans, cases of bottled water that had survived the cold without freezing because the warehouse had maintained just enough heat. They worked like demons for 6 hours, passing supplies through the gap, loading sleds until the loads threatened to break the scavenged ski poles they were using as handles. Then they heard voices outside, multiple people arguing over who had the right to claim the warehouse, and Marcus realized they were trapped with too much food to abandon and not enough fighters to defend it if it came to violence. He gathered his team, explained the situation, and asked them to make a choice, to decide whether they would fight for the food or try to negotiate with whoever was outside. The vote was unanimous. They would share. They had enough supplies to feed their community for months, enough to share with others and still have plenty, and hoarding when others were starving was the kind of behavior that had destroyed civilization in the first place. Marcus climbed out of the warehouse with his hands visible and empty, calling out that they had food to share, that they were willing to trade knowledge and supplies for peaceful cooperation. The group outside consisted of 8 people, gaunt and armed with clubs and improvised spears, led by a woman named Rita, who had been a social worker before the collapse. Rita stared at Marcus like he was insane, like the concept of sharing during a famine was so absurd that she couldn't process it, but hunger overcame suspicion, and she agreed to talk. They negotiated in the snow for an hour, Marcus offering food and survival training in exchange for labor to help transport the supplies, Rita offering knowledge about which areas of Denver were safe and which were controlled by violent gangs. By the time they finished talking, they had formed an alliance, 2 groups of survivors who would help each other because cooperation was the only thing that made sense in a world where going alone meant dying alone. They returned to the neighborhood with more food than they'd hoped for, and new allies who would help defend their community if other groups tried to take what they'd built. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of survival, a recognition that individual skills mattered less than collective organization, that teaching 1 person to purify water was useful, but teaching 50 people created resilience that could weather any disaster. He began documenting not just techniques, but organizational structures, writing about Rita's ideas for inter-community trade networks, about how groups could specialize in different skills and exchange surplus production, about how trust could be built, even among strangers, if there were clear rules and consequences for breaking them. But winter continued to deepen, and with it came new problems that knowledge alone couldn't solve. A measles outbreak swept through the community, killing 3 children before Priya could isolate the infected individuals and implement quarantine protocols. A fire destroyed part of their insulation system, forcing them to rebuild in temperatures that made outdoor work dangerous. A fight broke out between 2 families over stolen blankets, escalating to violence before Elena could mediate, resulting in injuries that depleted their medical supplies and trust that took weeks to rebuild. Marcus watched his community struggle, watched people who had been cooperative and kind become suspicious and selfish as resources dwindled, and he understood that survival wasn't just about having enough calories and clean water. It was about maintaining the social bonds that made cooperation possible. He started holding evening gatherings, community meetings where people shared stories, sang songs, told jokes, remembered the world that had been lost, and imagined the world they might build. The gatherings weren't about survival in the immediate sense. They didn't teach anyone how to purify water or build fires. But they reminded people why survival mattered, why struggling through another day of cold and hunger was worthwhile if it meant being part of something larger than individual existence. Marcus told stories about his marine deployments, about the friends he'd lost and the lessons they'd taught him, about the beauty he'd seen in the worst places on Earth. Terence taught history, explaining how other civilizations had survived catastrophes, how humanity had recovered from plagues and wars and climate disasters before. Elena led singing in languages Marcus didn't understand, melodies that carried emotions too deep for words, reminders that humans had been making music since before they'd learned to make fire. Samuel, who had fully recovered from his pneumonia, and who was now one of the community's best scavengers, started drawing pictures on the walls of the house, images of the people who lived there, of the community they were building, of the future he imagined when winter finally ended. The drawings were crude but powerful, visual reminders that survival wasn't the end goal. It was the means to something better, to a world where children could dream of futures instead of just fearing the next day. Marcus added those drawings to his journal, sketching copies because he believed they mattered as much as his technical notes, that art and beauty were survival tools just as essential as water filters and fire-starting methods. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, temperatures climbing from negative numbers to merely freezing, ash beginning to settle out of the atmosphere as rain finally fell for the first time in 5 months. The sun emerged from behind the clouds for a few hours each day, weak and distant but undeniably present, and Marcus felt hope bloom in his chest like the first crocuses that appeared in the creek bed. They had survived. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough to continue, enough to remember, enough to teach the next generation what knowledge had saved them. The community celebrated with a feast, using the last of their stored potatoes and the first greens that appeared in the thawing ground, dandelions and clover that provided vitamins they'd been lacking for months. But survival had costs that Marcus hadn't anticipated, prices paid in trauma and grief that would take years to heal. Priya couldn't sleep, haunted by the children she'd failed to save, by the medical decisions she'd made with insufficient information and inadequate supplies. Terence had chronic pain from frostbite damage to his feet, injuries he'd sustained during the Denver expedition that would probably never fully heal. Elena had stopped talking about her family, about the children and grandchildren she'd lost in the first weeks after the collapse, her silence a wall around grief too large to share. Samuel had nightmares, waking up screaming about the food riots, about watching his parents die, about being alone in the dark storage closet for 3 days before Marcus found him. Marcus organized what he called a grief circle, a space where people could talk about what they'd lost, where tears were not weakness and anger was not shameful, where trauma could be acknowledged instead of buried. He shared his own grief, the guilt he carried for every person he'd failed to help, for every child he'd found too late, for his sister Maria, who he'd never found despite searching for weeks. The circle met every evening for a month, people taking turns speaking or simply sitting in silence, supported by others who understood that survival meant more than just keeping bodies alive. It meant maintaining the humanity that made life worth living. Priya talked about her daughter, about the 6-year-old who had died in her arms during the first week, about the rage she felt at a universe that would create diseases she couldn't treat, about the guilt that came with being a medical professional who couldn't perform medicine. Terence cried about his students, about the teenagers who had trusted him to keep them safe, about the boy who had sacrificed himself to let others escape the burning school. Elena finally spoke about her son, about the man who had moved to America to give his family a better life, about the grandson she'd been visiting when the collapse happened and who had disappeared into the chaos of the first days. Samuel, who had been silent for most of the month, suddenly told them about his parents' last words, about his mother telling him to hide and his father promising to come back, about understanding even then that they were lying because they loved him too much to tell him the truth. The grief circle became a healing circle, people supporting each other through the trauma, and Marcus added notes about psychological survival to his journal, writing about the importance of processing emotions, about how communities that acknowledged grief recovered faster than communities that tried to ignore it. He wrote about the need for ritual, for ceremonies that marked losses and celebrated survivals, for formal ways to say goodbye to the dead and welcome the living into new roles. He wrote about hope, about how it had to be practiced like any other skill, how it was a choice people made every day to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. As spring turned to early summer, the community began planning for the future, for the crops they would plant, and the structures they would build, and the children they would teach. Marcus organized classes, turning his journal into a curriculum, teaching anyone who would listen about water purification, shelter construction, food preservation, medical care, tool-making, and everything else he'd learned or documented. He trained teachers, people who would carry the knowledge forward, who would spread survival expertise to other communities forming in the wasteland. Rita's group had found 15 other survivor communities within a day's walk, small clusters of people who were trying to rebuild, and they established a network where knowledge and resources could flow freely between groups. Marcus met with the leaders of each community, sharing his journal and learning from their experiences, understanding that survival expertise was being developed simultaneously in dozens of places, that humanity's collective intelligence was too distributed to be destroyed by any single catastrophe. He learned about hydroponic growing systems from a community led by former agricultural researchers, about renewable energy generation from engineers who had salvaged solar panels and wind turbines, about water management from city planners who understood infrastructure systems. He added all of it to his journal, now multiple volumes, that documented not just his knowledge, but the collective wisdom of everyone he'd met. The community built a school, the first formal educational institution in the post-collapse world, where children learned reading and math alongside water purification and shelter construction. Samuel became a teacher, despite his age, showing other children how to scavenge safely, how to recognize useful materials, how to stay alive in the ruins. Priya trained medical assistants, people who could provide basic care and recognize when injuries were beyond their ability to treat. Terence created a library, collecting books from abandoned houses, preserving knowledge that existed only in printed form now that the internet was gone. Elena established a conflict resolution system, a court of sorts where disputes could be settled fairly, where justice was about restoration rather than punishment. Marcus watched his community grow from 5 desperate survivors to nearly 200 people living in a functional society. And he understood that this was what survival meant at its deepest level, not just keeping individuals alive, but maintaining the social structures that allowed humans to live together cooperatively. He continued teaching, but his lessons expanded beyond physical survival to include ethics, philosophy, psychology, everything that made humans more than just clever animals trying not to starve. He taught about the importance of honesty, about how lies destroyed trust, and trust was the foundation of community. He taught about responsibility, about how each person's choices affected everyone else, about how freedom without accountability was just another form of violence. He taught about hope, about how believing in a better future was what separated humans from animals, about how imagination was a survival tool that could create realities that didn't yet exist. 2 years after the collapse, Marcus received word that a radio operator in Boulder had managed to get a shortwave transmitter working, that communities across North America were beginning to reconnect, sharing information about what had worked and what had failed, building a knowledge network that might prevent the mistakes that had killed so many in the first months. Marcus traveled to Boulder, carrying his journals, ready to share everything he'd learned with anyone who would listen. The operator, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been an electrical engineering professor before the collapse, had been collecting survival reports from across the continent, documenting which techniques had saved lives and which had proven ineffective. They spent 3 days comparing notes, Marcus sharing his knowledge about thermal shelter construction and water purification, while Sarah shared reports about solar power systems and food cultivation strategies. They talked about the communities that had survived and the communities that had failed, looking for patterns, trying to understand what separated resilience from collapse. They discovered that the successful communities shared common characteristics. They had leaders who taught rather than hoarded knowledge. They had systems for conflict resolution. They valued cooperation over competition, and they had maintained hope even during the darkest periods. The failed communities had collapsed into violence, had consumed their resources without planning for the future, had lost social cohesion when stressed by scarcity. Sarah proposed creating a network of teachers, people who would travel between communities sharing knowledge and collecting new techniques, essentially rebuilding civilization one survival skill at a time. Marcus agreed immediately, understanding that this was the next phase of his mission, that teaching one community wasn't enough when thousands of communities were struggling to survive. He returned home, gathered a team of teachers from his community, and began training them to carry knowledge forward. They would travel in pairs, always teaching and always learning, creating a web of shared information that would be resilient enough to survive even if individual nodes failed. Before he left on his first teaching journey, Marcus stood in front of his community and tried to explain what they'd built together, what they meant to him, why he had to leave, even though staying would be easier. He talked about the responsibility that came with knowledge, about how every skill he possessed was worthless if it died with him, about how humanity's survival depended on millions of people making the choice to share instead of hoard, to teach instead of guard their expertise. He talked about the children, about Samuel and the dozens of others who had grown up in the post-collapse world, about how they deserved to inherit something more than just ruins and suffering. He talked about hope, about how it was a skill that had to be practiced, about how teaching was how he maintained his own hope that the future could be better than the past. Samuel, now 14 years old and taller than Marcus remembered, stood up and said something that made Marcus's throat tight with emotion. The boy talked about being found in that pharmacy, about being given antibiotics and warmth and knowledge, about how Marcus had saved his life not just by keeping him alive, but by showing him that life was worth living. He talked about the community they'd built, about how it had become his family in place of the parents he'd lost, about how he wanted to become a teacher like Marcus so he could pass forward the gifts he'd received. He said that knowledge was love made practical, that teaching was how humans took care of each other across time and distance, that survival was meaningless unless it was shared survival. Marcus left the next morning with 3 other teachers, carrying copies of his journals and supplies for 3 months of travel, heading north toward communities that Sarah had identified as struggling. They walked through landscapes that were slowly healing, ash settling into soil that would eventually support new growth, wildlife returning to areas abandoned by humans. They taught in ruins and refugee camps, in makeshift communities and organized settlements, sharing water purification techniques and food preservation methods and shelter construction principles. They learned as much as they taught, collecting new techniques and better approaches, understanding that survival knowledge was being developed everywhere humans gathered, that the catastrophe had forced humanity to remember skills that had been forgotten in the age of easy technology. In a community built around a former ski resort, Marcus met a woman named Dr. Lisa Martinez, who had been a botanist before the collapse and who had spent 2 years developing cold-resistant crop varieties that could survive in the changed climate. She showed him greenhouses built from salvaged materials, using passive solar design to maintain growing temperatures without fuel, producing vegetables that could supplement the meat and foraged foods that most communities relied on. Marcus added her techniques to his journals, understanding that agricultural knowledge would be crucial as communities transitioned from scavenging to producing their own food. He spent a month learning from Lisa, helping her teach others how to save seeds and manage pests and rotate crops to maintain soil fertility. In Wyoming, he found a community that had solved the problem of winter heat by retrofitting houses with thermal mass systems, using water-filled barrels and stone walls to store heat during the day and release it at night, creating stable temperatures without burning precious fuel. The engineer who designed the systems, a man named Robert Kim, who had worked in renewable energy before the collapse, taught Marcus about heat transfer physics and insulation values and passive solar design principles. Marcus documented everything, understanding that these techniques would work in any climate, that the knowledge could save lives across the continent. In Montana, he discovered a community that had maintained law and order through a restorative justice system, where crimes were addressed by bringing together the offender, the victim, and the community to find solutions that repaired harm rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. The system's creator, a former criminal defense attorney named Patricia Gonzalez, explained how punitive justice had broken down during the collapse, how communities that relied on punishment had descended into cycles of revenge and violence, while communities that focused on restoration had maintained social cohesion. Marcus spent weeks learning the mediation techniques, understanding that psychological and social survival were as important as physical survival. He traveled for 2 years, teaching and learning, watching humanity slowly rebuild from the ashes of the old civilization. The network of teachers grew, dozens becoming hundreds, becoming thousands, spreading across North America and then beyond as communications improved and connections strengthened. The knowledge base expanded exponentially, survival techniques combining with rediscovered technologies and innovative adaptations, creating a new body of practical wisdom that was more resilient than the fragile technological civilization that had collapsed. Marcus's journals became curriculum, printed on salvaged paper and distributed to communities across the continent, teaching people how to survive and how to live. But he never forgot the lessons of that first winter, the understanding that survival was about more than just techniques and technologies. He taught water purification, and he taught compassion. He taught shelter construction, and he taught conflict resolution. He taught food preservation, and he taught hope. He understood that humanity's survival depended on maintaining both the practical knowledge that kept bodies alive and the ethical principles that kept souls human, that civilization was a practice rather than a possession, something that had to be renewed every day through countless small choices to cooperate rather than compete, to share rather than hoard, to teach rather than guard expertise. 10 years after the collapse, Marcus returned to his original community, older and tired, but still driven by the mission that had sustained him through a decade of teaching. The community had grown to nearly 1,000 people, occupying several neighborhoods, operating as a small city with governance structures and economic systems and cultural institutions. Samuel was 22 now, leading a team of teachers, preparing to travel south to communities in Texas and Mexico. Bria had trained 30 medical assistants and had written a comprehensive manual on post-collapse medicine that was being used across the continent. Terence had collected over 10,000 books in his library, preserving knowledge for future generations. Elena, now in her 70s, had developed a mediation training program that had reduced violent conflict in the community to nearly zero. They held a ceremony to honor Marcus's return, but it felt strange to him, being celebrated for doing what seemed like the obvious thing, sharing knowledge that would have been worthless if kept to himself. He stood in front of a community that had become more than he'd imagined possible and tried to explain what he'd learned during his travels, what he'd come to understand about survival and humanity and the future. He talked about the communities he'd visited, about the innovative solutions people had developed, about the resilience of human creativity when faced with impossible challenges. He talked about the teachers he'd trained, about how the network was now self-sustaining, about how knowledge was flowing freely between communities without needing his coordination. But mostly he talked about hope, about how it was the most important survival skill of all, about how believing in a better future was what separated humans from animals that could only react to immediate circumstances. He talked about the children being born into the post-collapse world, about how they would never remember the old civilization but would inherit the knowledge that survivors had preserved. He talked about the responsibility of the first generation, the people who remembered both worlds, to teach not just survival techniques but the values that would prevent humanity from making the same mistakes again. He talked about choosing cooperation over competition, sustainability over exploitation, community over individualism, about how these choices were more important than any specific technique or technology. Samuel stood up and asked Marcus to stay, to stop traveling and spend his remaining years teaching in the community that had been his first home after the collapse. Marcus wanted to say yes, wanted to rest, wanted to watch the gardens grow and the children learn and the civilization slowly rebuild. But he knew there were still communities struggling, still people who needed knowledge to survive, still teachers who needed training. He compromised, agreeing to spend part of each year at home and part traveling, understanding that teaching was now his identity, that he couldn't stop, even if he wanted to, because too many lives depended on the knowledge he carried. He lived another 20 years, teaching until his body finally failed, documenting survival techniques until his hands could no longer hold a pen. His journals, now filling dozens of volumes, became the foundational texts of post-collapse education, used in schools across the rebuilt civilization. The communities he helped stabilize grew into towns and then cities, proving that humanity could recover from even the most catastrophic failures. The teachers he trained became the leaders of the new world, people who understood that knowledge was the most valuable resource, that sharing expertise was more important than hoarding power, that civilization was built from millions of small acts of teaching and learning. In the end, Marcus died the way he'd lived, surrounded by students explaining one last survival technique, a method for starting fires using ice as a lens, a trick he'd learned from an Inuit elder during his travels in Alaska. His last words were about hope, about believing that humanity would continue to survive and adapt and grow, about trusting that the knowledge he'd shared would ripple forward through generations, saving lives he would never know about in places he would never visit. Samuel held his hand as he died, promising to continue the work, to keep teaching, to honor the gift of knowledge that Marcus had given so freely. The legacy he left wasn't measured in monuments or institutions, though both were eventually built in his name. His legacy was measured in lives saved, in children who grew up knowing how to purify water and build shelter and grow food, in communities that survived because someone had taught them how. His legacy was measured in the network of teachers that continued long after his death, in the journals that became textbooks, in the survival techniques that became common knowledge. His legacy was measured in the civilization that slowly rebuilt itself, stronger and more resilient than before, founded on principles of cooperation and sustainability that Marcus had demonstrated through his teaching. Marcus Rivera's story became a legend, told around campfires and in classrooms, a reminder of what one person could accomplish by choosing to share rather than hoard, to teach rather than guard expertise, to hope rather than despair. The survivors who remembered him talked about his patience, his kindness, his unwavering belief that humanity was worth saving even at its worst moments. They talked about how he'd never claimed to have all the answers, how he'd learned as much as he taught, how he'd treated every person he met as a potential teacher with valuable knowledge to share. They talked about how he'd maintained his humanity through the darkest times, how he'd cried for the people he couldn't save and celebrated with the people he could, how he'd never stopped believing that knowledge could make the difference between survival and extinction. The world Marcus left behind was still harsh, still struggling, still recovering from the catastrophe that had killed billions, but it was also hopeful, resilient, and determined to build something better than what had been lost. The communities he helped establish had become the seeds of a new civilization, one founded on sustainability and cooperation rather than exploitation and competition. The teachers he trained had taught others, creating a chain of knowledge that stretched across continents and generations. The journals he wrote had preserved techniques and wisdom that might have been lost, ensuring that humanity's collective intelligence survived even when individual humans didn't. His greatest achievement wasn't any single technique or community, it was the culture of sharing he helped create. The understanding that survival was a collective project rather than an individual competition. He'd proven that knowledge freely given multiplied rather than diminished, that teaching empowered rather than weakened the teacher, that cooperation was more effective than competition in the long run. He demonstrated through his life that hope was a choice, that humanity was worth believing in, that the future could be better than the past if people were willing to work for it. Decades after Marcus's death, his name became synonymous with survival education. His methods taught in schools around the world, his philosophy of hope and cooperation embedded in the culture of the rebuilt civilization. Children learned to purify water using techniques he'd documented, built shelters using principles he'd taught, grew food using methods he'd shared. Adults told stories about the teacher who had walked through the wasteland sharing knowledge, who had chosen to help rather than hoard, who had believed in humanity's future when the present seemed hopeless. His journals, carefully preserved and continually updated by successive generations of teachers, became sacred texts, not because they were perfect, but because they represented humanity's determination to survive and to remember. The electromagnetic pulse that destroyed technological civilization couldn't destroy human knowledge, couldn't erase the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, couldn't prevent survivors from teaching each other how to live. Marcus understood this from the beginning. Understood that civilization existed not in buildings or machines, but in the knowledge people carried and shared, in the techniques passed from teacher to student, in the collective intelligence that made humans the most adaptable species on Earth. He dedicated his life to preserving and spreading that knowledge, to ensuring that humanity's survival toolkit remained intact and accessible, to proving that education was the ultimate survival skill. This is why his story matters. why it's told and retold, why communities across the rebuilt world honor his memory. Not because he was perfect or superhuman, but because he was ordinary, a normal person who chose to teach when he could have chosen to hoard, who shared when he could have hidden, who hoped when he could have despaired. He demonstrated that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the most prepared. It was about being willing to help others, to share knowledge freely, to believe that cooperation was more powerful than competition. He showed that one person teaching could save thousands, that knowledge shared multiplied exponentially, that hope practiced became reality. In the end, Marcus Rivera's fire-starting skills did save him, but not in the way most people expected. They saved him by giving him something to teach, by creating opportunities to help others, by providing purpose that sustained him through years of hardship. His shelter-building knowledge did save him, but by allowing him to teach communities how to survive winters together. His water purification expertise did save him, but by creating trust between strangers who became allies. Every survival technique he knew became valuable, not just for keeping himself alive, but for keeping humanity alive, for ensuring that knowledge survived even when individuals didn't, for building a future where children could learn to thrive instead of just struggling to survive. Your fire-starting skills might keep you warm for one night, but teaching others to start fires keeps humanity warm for generations. Your water purification knowledge might save your life for a day, but sharing that knowledge saves lives forever. Your survival expertise matters most when you give it away freely, when you understand that knowledge is the one resource that multiplies when shared, when you choose to be a teacher instead of just a survivor. This is Marcus Rivera's ultimate lesson, the wisdom that survived when everything else failed, the truth that rebuilding civilization one student at a time is how humanity survives the unsurvivable. This is why we remember him, why we honor him, why we continue his work, teaching and learning and sharing, ensuring that knowledge never dies even when individuals do, proving every day that hope practiced becomes reality, that humanity's greatest strength is our ability to learn from each other and teach each other and lift each other up through the sharing of knowledge that costs nothing to give but saves everything worth preserving. Where are you right now as you hear this story? What time is it in your corner of the world? Share in the comments how you're preparing, what survival skills you're learning, what knowledge you're ready to pass forward. Because Marcus's story isn't just history, it's a blueprint for the future, a reminder that we're all teachers and students, all carriers of knowledge that might someday save lives, all part of humanity's collective intelligence that can survive anything if we choose cooperation over competition, sharing over hoarding, hope over despair. The skills you learn today might be what saves someone tomorrow. The knowledge you share might be what rebuilds civilization. The choice you make to teach instead of guard expertise might be what separates survival from extinction.